Voyage2Go History. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 7 of my historical travel podcast Voyage2Go History, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In this true story, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist in the 18th century, aboard a sailing ship under the command of James Cook. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern language. His knowledge is that of the late 18th century, so I will place some of his statements in context and provide additional information. What happened in the last episode?
In the last episode, Georg Forster embarked on an adventurous ascent of Table Mountain, overcoming steep trails and loose stones. Along the way, they encountered vibrant plant life, nourished by trickling springs and aromatic breezes. After hours of climbing, they reached the barren yet breathtaking summit, offering panoramic views of Table Bay, Lion's Head, and the surrounding landscapes, including cultivated fields and the famed Constantia estate. The southeastern slopes captivated their attention with lush plantations and oak-lined streams, while the valley known as Paradise showcased tropical fruits thriving in this temperate climate. Their visit to Alphen, the residence of Mr. Kirsten, provided a hospitable base for their botanical explorations, yielding impressive collections of new plant species. The episode also highlighted the region's abundant wildlife, from antelopes and buffalo to colorful birds and rare insects. While exploring the colony's natural and cultural wealth, the crew reflected on the immense potential for scientific discovery in Africa's untamed interior.
Sunday, November 22nd, 1772, Table Bay, Cape Colony.
At 4 p.m., they sailed out of Table Bay, bidding farewell to the fort. The restless ocean, which they now trusted themselves to once again, greeted them in no pleasant manner. The entire night, they battled fierce gusts of wind. The sea glowed faintly, much like it had upon their arrival, though less intensely than before. By the following day at 8 a.m., they lost sight of the Cape and sailed southward. As they embarked on a journey no one had attempted before, and were unsure when or where they might find a place to resupply, the captain issued strict orders to conserve drinking water. A guard was stationed at the water cask, and each crew member received a fixed daily ration. They were allowed to drink directly from the cask, but were not permitted to take any water away. Even the captain washed with seawater, and the rest of the company had to follow suit. The improved distillation apparatus by Mr. Irving was kept running constantly to replace at least some of the sweet water consumed. On November 24th, after a previous storm, they enjoyed calm weather in the afternoon and caught 9 albatrosses using lines baited with pieces of sheep's wool. Some of these birds measured over 3 meters from wingtip to wingtip. The younger ones had brown feathers mixed into their plumage, while the adults were entirely white, except for their wings, which were black and striped at the upper joint, with some scattered black feathers. That same day, a large brown fish resembling a sunfish briefly appeared beside the ship.
The ocean sunfish, or mola mola, is one of the heaviest bony fish in the world, capable of reaching weights of over 1,000 kilograms or 2,200 pounds. Known for its distinct appearance, the sunfish has a flattened, oval body with tall dorsal and anal fins that give it a unique, almost disc-like shape. It inhabits tropical and temperate oceans worldwide, often basking near the surface, which earned it the name sunfish.
On November 29th, after 3 days of stormy weather, the wind grew so fierce that they could carry only the foresail for 24 hours. The sea rose dangerously high, often breaking over the ship. Those who were not sailors struggled to adapt to these conditions. Having had exceptionally good weather from England to the Cape, they had not prepared for such storms. The violent rolling of the ship caused daily chaos in their cabins, smashing cups, glasses, bottles, tables, and dishes. Despite the destruction, the humorous incidents during the general turmoil provided moments of laughter that made them more resigned to the losses. The worst part was that the cabins remained perpetually wet, and the howling wind, roaring waves, and violent tossing of the ship allowed for almost no activity. These were new and frightening scenes, and they were also extremely exhausting and unpleasant. Adding to their misery, despite being only at 42 degrees south latitude, the air had grown noticeably cold and sharp. Frequent rain made work even harder for the crew. To protect them somewhat from the harsh conditions, the captain distributed clothes specially procured by the Admiralty. Each person exposed to the harsh southern climate, from lieutenants to common sailors, received a jacket and trousers made of thick wool or strong flannel called fear-knot. These garments resisted moisture well, though, like other Admiralty supplies, they were often too short or tight. The plight of Monsieur de Bougainville's crew, who suffered from inadequate clothing and similar conditions, made it clear that English sailors were far better off in this regard. Their government, fair and focused on the welfare of its people, ensured that sailors could always rely on being equipped with everything necessary to protect them from the dangers of the sea. This care and support also helped maintain their morale during hardships. In contrast, when a state neglects such attentiveness, and sailors realize that no one genuinely cares for their well-being, they grow resentful and demoralized. In times of trial, which are frequent on the sea, they might succumb to despair, with all its devastating consequences. Often it is the crew's courage and willingness to act that can save the ship in such moments. That night, they faced a critical situation. A non-commissioned officer sleeping in the forward section of the ship awoke suddenly. He heard water rushing through his sleeping quarters and pounding against the chests belonging to him and his comrades. He immediately jumped out of bed and found himself standing calf-deep in water. Without hesitation, he alerted the officer on the quarterdeck about this alarming situation. Within minutes, the entire ship was awake and in motion. The crew began pumping water while the officers, unusually kind and encouraging, urged them to keep working as hard as they could. Despite their efforts, the water seemed to be gaining. Fear and panic spread among the men, and the darkness of the night only intensified the dreadfulness of their predicament. The crew operated the chain and bilge pumps with great urgency and effort. To everyone's relief, they discovered that the water was not entering through an unseen or inaccessible leak, as they had feared. Instead, it had entered through a bosun's storeroom window or vent, which had not been secured tightly enough against the stormy seas. The waves had forced it open. This issue was quickly resolved, and the window was sealed again. They escaped this ordeal with no further damage, except that the clothes and belongings of both the sailors and officers were thoroughly soaked by the seawater. If the officer had not awakened in time, likely by sheer providence, the situation could have overwhelmed them. Even the determination of the officers and the courage of the crew would have been in vain. They would have sunk in the violent storm with no chance of rescue from the other ship due to the dark night and rough waves. Around this time, fishing lines and hooks were distributed to everyone on board, so they could make immediate use of them once they reached land. Unfortunately, the rough weather had already cost them 6 large pigs and several sheep. The stormy conditions persisted, alternating with rain and fog, until December 5th. That day, the wind calmed for the first time since leaving the Cape, allowing them to hoist the topmost sails. At noon, they determined their position at 47 degrees 10 south latitude. Their joy at the improved weather was short-lived. By the afternoon, rain returned, and massive waves rolling in from the west warned them of an approaching wind shift. That night, the wind indeed turned to the southwest, bringing frigid air. The temperature dropped from 44 degrees Fahrenheit to 38 degrees Fahrenheit overnight.
Monday, December 7, 1772, Indian Ocean.
By dawn, the crew saw a light dusting of snow. The wind increased significantly, and by afternoon they were forced to sail with only one sail. Flocks of petrels and terns, seemingly indifferent to the stormy winds and turbulent seas, surrounded the ship. Their numbers only seemed to grow as the weather worsened. The most common species were the Cape petrel, known as the pintada, and the blue petrel, named for its bluish-gray feathers and dark streak across the wings. Occasionally they spotted two types of albatrosses, along with a third kind the sailors called Quakers due to their sooty gray-brown color. On the 8th, with the sea still restless and the wind fierce, they noticed many birds of the aforementioned species surrounding the ship. For the first time, they also spotted penguins and patches of floating seaweed, known as sea bamboo, near the ship. These signs raised their hopes of finding land, as it was widely believed that such seaweed and penguins were never encountered far from the coast. However, experience had shown that these indications could not be entirely trusted. Their credibility was based more on isolated, favorable incidents and the testimony of certain renowned navigators than on consistent evidence. Observing the appearance and condition of seaweed and driftwood in the future could, perhaps, lead to more reliable conclusions. Since seaweed does not originate in the open ocean but grows on rocks and is dislodged by waves or other forces, its degree of decay might offer clues. The level of decomposition could hint at how long it had been adrift, and in rare cases, even the approximate distance from its source. Yet, this would require factoring in the direction and strength of winds and currents, among other variables. On the morning of December 9th, they were finally able to set their large sails again, as the storm had subsided somewhat. Despite the calmer weather, the thermometer showed only 35 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.7 degrees Celsius, at 9 a.m., and rose no higher than 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 2.2 degrees Celsius, by noon, even though they were only at 49°45 south latitude. By nightfall, the temperature dropped further, and at 9:30 p.m., the thermometer on deck read close to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius. Ice began to form on the edges of the water barrels. This cold seemed to herald the arrival of drifting ice, which they encountered the following morning. The first sight was a massive chunk of ice that they had to navigate around quickly. Another large piece appeared directly ahead, and a third could be seen about 3.7 kilometers, 2 nautical miles upwind, rising like a white cape or chalk cliff from the sea. In the afternoon, they passed a massive rectangular block of ice, approximately 610 meters, 2,000 feet long, 122 meters, 400 feet wide, and at least twice the height of their tallest central mast, roughly 61 meters, 200 feet. Based on Boylan's and Myron's experiments, where the density of ice to seawater is approximately 10:9, it followed from known hydrostatic principles that the visible portion of the ice above water was 1/10 of the total mass. If the block of ice had a regular shape, it would have extended 549 meters, 1,800 feet below the water, making the total height around 610 meters, 2,000 feet. Considering its width at 122 meters, 400 feet, and its length at 610 meters, 2,000 feet, this single block of ice would have contained approximately 45 million cubic meters, 1.6 billion cubic feet, of ice. Such enormous masses of ice appear to drift very slowly and imperceptibly. Since most of their volume is submerged, the force of the wind and waves has little impact on them. Ocean currents are likely the primary force driving their movement. However, even the strongest currents might not move them more than approximately 3.7 kilometers, 2 nautical miles, in 24 hours. During this first journey toward the South Pole, their understanding of the origin of drifting ice was based on mere speculation. These assumptions could only have been considered plausible at best, given the lack of further experience. However, after completing their circumnavigation of the world without discovering the southern continent, whose existence was widely believed in Europe, their earlier suspicions were confirmed. They now found it more than likely that this drifting ice formed directly in open water.
Drifting ice can form directly in open water under specific conditions. When air temperatures drop below freezing, the surface water cools and tiny ice crystals called phrasal ice begin to form. These crystals grow and aggregate as the cooling continues. Wind and currents then move the ice, creating drifting ice in the open water. This process is common in polar regions or during winter in cold climates.
Repeated and decisive experiments had established that seawater could indeed freeze. For example, Mr. Adamson, on his return from Senegal, had filled bottles with seawater under various latitudes. During his journey from Brest to Paris in the middle of winter, the water froze, shattering the bottles. The resulting ice produced fresh water, and the small amount of concentrated saline water that did not freeze had leaked out. Similarly, Mr. Edward Nairne, a member of the London Academy, conducted experiments during the severe frost of 1776. His findings irrefutably demonstrated that seawater could freeze into solid ice and yield fresh water upon thawing. This drifting ice demonstrated a significant difference between the climates of the northern and southern hemispheres. It was mid-December, equivalent to June in the southern hemisphere. Their observed latitude was only 51 degrees and 5 minutes south, comparable to the latitude of London. Yet they had already encountered several icebergs, and the thermometer stood at 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The lack of solid landmass in the southern hemisphere seemed to contribute to the relative coldness of this region. In this area, there was nothing but sea, which, as a transparent and fluid body, absorbed the sun's rays instead of reflecting them, as happens with land in the northern hemisphere. On December 11th at 3 p.m., they passed by an ice island, at least 800 meters long, situated on the windward side. The thermometer on deck, which had risen to approximately 41 degrees Fahrenheit under clear sunshine at 2 p.m., gradually dropped to 37.5 degrees Fahrenheit as they approached the ice. Once they passed it, the thermometer returned to its earlier reading of 41 degrees Fahrenheit. This 4-degree difference was perceptible on the body, showing clearly that, in addition to the already mentioned causes, these large masses of ice contributed to the cold air of these unfriendly seas. The waves crashed with tremendous force against this ice island, as if it were a solid, immovable rock. Despite being not much lower than the previously described ice mass, the waves rose so high that the foam often sprayed far above it. This created an excellent view in the bright, clear weather. The seawater hurled onto the ice likely froze solid there, an occurrence that likely explained its formation and accumulation. Despite the cold of this latitude, their ships remained surrounded by storm petrels, albatrosses, and penguins. Particularly, they observed a storm petrel the size of a pigeon, entirely white, with a black beak and bluish feet. This bird always hovered around the ice masses and could therefore be regarded as a harbinger of ice. They called it the snow petrel because of its color. On December 9th in the morning, they were finally able to set their large sails again as the storm had subsided somewhat. However, despite the milder weather, the thermometer had dropped to 35 degrees Fahrenheit by 9 a.m. and rose only by 1 degree by noon, even though their observed latitude was 49 degrees 45 south. Towards the evening, the temperature fell further, and by 10:30, the thermometer on deck registered near freezing at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The water in their drinking barrel even began to freeze at the edges. This cold seemed to be a precursor to the drifting ice they encountered the next morning.
This concludes part 7 of Georg Forster's journey around the world aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of James Cook. I have linked a map of the locations of this episode in the show notes. For those who would like to see the locations of the journey around the world on the present day, I recommend my YouTube channel, Voyage2Go. There, I visit the places from Georg Forster's travel narrative and try to uncover traces and connections between today and the past. So that was episode 7 of our journey around the world with Georg Forster, Captain Cook, and the Resolution, on which we will continue our travels together in the coming weeks. I hope we can travel a little further together, because life is a journey Being part of it is everything.